Last time I talked about the common identification of consciousness with attention, or with short-term memory, which is what you use attention to get information into. And this identification of consciousness with attention raises the question of how much information processing can go on before attention is paid to an object. So how much can you get in before you've actually had your attention drawn to it or paid your attention to it? Where are we? Is this not, sorry, I thought that this was doing this. There we go. Sorry. Okay. And so the question here is, how much can you analyze anything? And if you can, how much can you analyze something without paying conscious attention to it? And I went over those two broad classes of theories last time. Early selection theories like the classic filter theory and late selection theories, which offer different answers to that question. Essentially, the early selection theories, which have been, until recently, the dominant way of thinking about attention, argued that pre-attentive processing, or in our terms, pre-conscious processing, is limited to relatively elementary analyses of perceptual structure. There are some exceptions to this, but basically what you do pre-attentively is analyze the environment in terms of its physical properties or its physical features. The late selection theories afforded the possibility of doing at least some semantic analyses pre-attentively as well, which set up a basic battle between proponents of early selection and proponents of late selection. A battle that was basically cut around, if you will, by Daniel Kahneman in an important book which hardly anybody reads anymore because they're reading his more recent work, called Attention and Effort, in which Kahneman tried to completely recast our understanding of attention. Instead of thinking about attention as some kind of filter or bottleneck or something like that, what Kahneman did was to redefine attention in terms of mental effort. Okay? That is to say, when you pay attention to something, you are engaging in some kind of effortful cognitive activity which draws on some kind of resource that you have in your head, a resource which is limited. So when you pay attention to some object or some other object, you are devoting cognitive resources to that thing, and you can't devote cognitive resources to that thing. So that's what we mean by an allocation policy. What is it that you're going to pay attention to? And what is it that you're going to process? Kahneman argued that allocation policy, an individual's allocation policy, was determined by two different classes of features, if you will. One is what he called enduring dispositions, or if you will, cognitive habits that are deployed automatically in the process of information processing. And the other was momentary intentions, which are deployed consciously. Okay, so you've got automatic, unconscious cognitive habits, and you've got controlled, conscious intentions of various sorts. And then he said there are certain kinds of processes, there are certain kinds of tasks that are very attention demanding, and there are other tasks that are not attention demanding at all. If the tasks you're performing are relatively undemanding, if they don't demand much by way of cognitive resources, you can do a lot of them at once in parallel, if you will. But if the tasks that you're engaged with are cognitively demanding, then you have to focus on the one as opposed to lots of others. You have to perform those very demanding cognitive tasks in what's known as serial processing, or in series. That's a model, that's what it looks like. And I don't want you to spend a lot of time memorizing this diagram, but what you can see here is that there's a whole bunch of things you could do, and they draw various amounts of attentional effort, if you will, or attentional capacity. And depending on the demands of these tasks that are in front of you, you can do lots of them at once if they're not very demanding, or just one at a time if one of them is very demanding. This was a relatively radical change in how we think about attention. The traditional view, the received wisdom about attention, is that elementary processes, physical analyses typically, are pre-attentive in that they can be performed without attention being directed to them. And we basically can perform those consciously or they can be performed unconsciously, or as some people prefer, preconsciously. In this literature, unconscious and preconscious are used interchangeably, okay? We'll talk about this again a little bit later. But any kind of complex process required attention, and so it could be performed only consciously. That's the traditional view of attention. Kahneman's revisionist view altered that quite a bit. He agreed that elementary processes could be pre-attentive because elementary processes don't require much by way of cognitive resources. But Kahneman argued that complex processes can be performed pre-attentively as well, so long as that process has been automatized, okay? Where automaticity comes from is another question, but the general idea here is practice makes for automatic, that there are some kinds of information processing which are very, very complicated, but can be performed automatically outside of conscious awareness without devoting attention to them, so long as they've been well practiced and basically made into habits. Those of you who are musicians, especially those of you who are skilled musicians, know all about this. When you see a pattern of notes on the page, you don't say, oh, E flat, then F, then G, then B flat, then A. You don't read a piece of music like that, and you certainly don't translate it into finger movements on your piano or your clarinet or anything like that in any conscious, deliberate manner. You see the notes, you play them, okay? That wasn't the case when you were 5 years old, taking your first music lessons, but it's the case now that you're playing with the Berkeley Symphony or whatever it is that you're doing. That's because reading music, translating the notes on a page into finger movements and all that, that's all been automatized through a lot of practice. But that's a lot of information processing. Very, very, very complicated thing to do. Yeah? Well, I wouldn't think necessarily a split brain patient would have this kind of problem, but some amnesic patients might have this kind of problem. But there's a famous case of an amnesic patient who was, in fact, a skilled musician. He was at Oxford or Cambridge, if I remember correctly. And he was able to play familiar music beautifully, but he couldn't learn new music, okay? He could play from a score, but he couldn't memorize anything new, all right? So there, it was all in memory, it was all automatic, and his amnesia didn't disrupt that at all. But what it did, fortunately, he was a specialist in medieval and Renaissance music, so he wasn't having to learn the latest John Adams symphony or something like that. He actually got along pretty well. There's a film of him. Look for it on YouTube, you'll find it. And when you find it, send me the URL, okay, and I'll distribute it. Okay, so that's the general idea here. So what Kahneman does is to introduce this term, automaticity. Okay, so now the next question is, what do we mean by that? The general idea here actually comes from the other investigators like David LaBerge and R.D. Samuels, who argued that many complex tasks simply cannot be performed consciously. Skilled musicianship is a good example of this. And they argued that because many complex tasks can't be performed consciously, then there has to be some way to render at least some of the components of skilled performance unconscious and automatic. And LaBerge and Samuels especially offered a definition of automaticity in terms of the processing of information immediately into long-term memory without having to engage in very much cognitive effort or cognitive analysis, even if attention is deployed elsewhere. And to illustrate what they meant by automaticity, they turned to the phenomenon of reading. Everybody here is a skilled reader of his or her native language. But if you think about it for a second, reading is an enormously complicated activity. Okay, there is what's known as graphemic information, a pattern of ink strokes on a page, and the first thing you have to do if you're reading is analyze that whole array of graphemic information into features. Closed curves, open curves, horizontal lines, vertical lines, whatever. Then, by virtue of knowing how to read in some language, you have stored in memory a set of letter codes that identify certain combinations of elementary features as meaningful letters in a language. And then you've got, at another level, you've got what are known as spelling pattern codes. You know what are common spelling patterns in your language, what to do if you say GH in a word or TH in a word or whatever. And then you've also got, at an even higher level, you've got codes in memory for various kinds of words, and you've got information in memory about various kinds of combinations of words. If you read either in a sentence, you know to look for or. If you read neither in a sentence, you know to look for nor, and so on. All of that is knowledge that you acquire through the process of becoming a skilled reader. But when you're reading a passage in a language that you know well, like English or whatever, you don't pay any attention to any of that. It just happens automatically. The words are there, the sentences are there, whole paragraphs are there, and all of that. So what LaBerge and Samuels argued was that this initial process of feature detection was intrinsically automatic. That is, our visual system is built so as to decode an array of visual stimuli into its elementary features. Horizontal lines, vertical lines, closed curves, open curves, stuff like that. But that all the other aspects of reading are initially performed effortfully. When you were 3, 4 years old and you were first starting to learn to read, which is when kids start to learn to read these days, you actually sat there and said, ka-a-ta, right? Cat. Spelled out the word. You probably didn't do it quite that bluntly, but you did something very much like that. But as you became a more fluid reader, as you became more familiar with all those symbols, all of that became automatized through practice so that you don't have to devote any large amount of cognitive effort to reading. The automaticity of reading in skilled readers is nicely demonstrated by what's known as the Stroop interference experiment, which I won't take time to demonstrate today, but the GSIs will take you through it probably later this week. But in the Stroop interference experiment, subjects are simply asked to name the color of the ink in which various words are printed. And in the critical condition of the experiment, the words are themselves color names, and the color names are printed in colors other than the color that they name.